Professor Torsten Persson, you're going to give a keynote now. Torsten is a professor at Stockholm University, but also the centennial, or is it millennial professor? Which, either way, it's very important. So we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. So, thanks for the invitation, and thanks. Not sure that further lecture is a good way of describing it. I'm just going to give a paper, ongoing work with Tim Besley, which is not even certain. So, how does this relate to the theme of the conference? I guess. You know, in order to make progress on green issues, you need greenly oriented politicians, and for the backlash we see now, the environmental populism has been mentioned. That's also tied to a certain type of politicians, and those are often radical right politicians. And you know, in many countries of the world where there's a multi-party system and there's parliamentary democracy, these things are tied to particular parties, like green parties, in particular, and radical right parties. So to understand why, you know, green issues make progress on the political agenda or why they make regress, we need to understand these phenomena of the green and radical right party. When do they arise? When are they successful in bringing knowledge to the fore? And that's what this paper is about. You think that this is a kind of, we just go to the toolbox and then we take our framework for party politics and we look it up. The embarrassment is that much of political economics doesn't really have such a framework. You know, much of the analytical things we do take place in a case where we have two parties. Those two parties are divided on a left to right class politics issue. And of course, this was after Downs, this was designed to proxy democratic politics in the immediate post-war period. But then party entry has been a very important fact, especially under proportional representation that allows many parties. And, you know, as long as the new parties enter into this duopoly of center-left or center-right politics, then maybe it's still a good approximation. But you know, more recently, we have seen the entry, indeed, of green parties and radical right parties. And moreover, these parties tend to take opposite sides on a different political cleavage than the class cleavage, namely what political scientists and nowadays some economists call the GAL-PAN dimension. So GAL stands for Green, Alternative, Liberal, and PAN stands for Traditional, Authoritarian, and Nationalist. And that has a lot of attention. But then, so how do these parties exercise influence on politics? Partly by participating in political coalitions, government coalitions, and form governments both with the center left and the center right. So those are the kind of issues that we will try to understand. So very concretely, we're trying to develop a formalized analytical framework that you know, starts with a traditional left-right redistributive policy kind of dimension. But then we add a second dimension, which has two other policies. One would be green issues. Think about it concretely as regulating environmental pollution. The other one would be more nationalistic issues. Think about it as regulating migration for practical purposes. And then we're going to begin with two incumbent mainstream parties, and we're going to show that it may very well be that these two parties don't address the issues in this cultural that more cultural dimension. So little gets done about environmental pollution, little gets done about immigration. And that's kind of sows the seed for entry of either a Green Party or a radical right party. So we study the conditions under which such entry would occur. A party would try to seek influence via participating in the government coalition, offering a deal to the mainstream parties on the redistributive side, while asking for something on their side, the nationalistic side, or the green side in return. So that's basically what we do, and we study two types of entry, that kind of policy-seeking entry, and also a type of backlash entry against a new policy. For example, when the radical right becomes active to counteract too much green stuff going on in politics. So that's essentially what we do. We're related to a lot of political science work, some political economics work. There's a small literature on both party entry and party formation. And as you will see at the very end, I'll discuss that there are issues like entry anticipation and entry deterrence that remind of things that happen in IO when firms try to prevent entry. So here is my roadmap. I'll start by showing you some key patterns in the data. I'll talk you through the core model, show a political equilibrium without entry, where essentially the mainstream parties ignore the green issues and the radical right issues. Then we'll go to open the possibility to entry, or think about the shock that makes entry desirable for some groups in society. Quickly back to the data, and then I'm almost surely out of time. So let me show you some data from 45 years in 30 plus European countries, which have been dominated by the center left and the center right. In fact, 86% of the seats in the parliaments of those countries were held by center left or center right parties. I'm going to use a classification of parties into 4 different types. So on the side of the center right and the center left, there's going to be green parties and radical right parties. I'm going to say that entry is when you gain at least 1 electoral seat close to a certain cutoff date. Then I'll show how these parties or these party families score on 2 dimensions, the left to right dimension and the Galton dimension, using classifications that political scientists have done of different political parties. And then I'm going to show you how both green and radical right parties do participate in government coalition. I'm going to say that a government coalition happens when you have at least 1 ministerial seat, and I'm going to classify the leading party by the prime minister's party. So this is a map of Europe in 1990. Sweden has the Green Party, Germany has the Green Party, Norway has the Radical Right Party, France has the National Front at this point. So purple and green go for radical right and green parties. And then in Italy, you have both types of parties. In some countries which are yellow, you only have center-right and center-left parties. Fast forward to 2005, we see there are more striped countries on the map. They have now both types of parties. Turkey has a radical right party, which we know still exists and provides the prime minister. But a few parties are still only center-left, center-right. And then we go to 2020, and almost all the countries for which we have data have either one, but most often both types of new parties. this is the scoring of these parties done by political scientists. So it's in 2 dimensions. I do point to this one. Not visible. Anyway, purple as before is radical right. Green is the green parties. Red are center left parties. Blue are center right parties. We have the left to right horizontal axis and the Galtan on the vertical axis. And as you can see, the left, center left and center right are placed predictably to the left and to the right. On the Galtan score, they are sort of closer to 0, whereas the green and the purple ones, the green parties and the radical right parties, take opposite ends of on this cultural dimension. Also, if you ask individuals, there is a strong negative correlation from their views on things like migration policy and green policy. So, it's no surprise that they take this opposite side. Here is a picture of the coalitions that green parties had engaged in. So this is the population of coalitions during these 45 years, so it's not all that many. So the amount of sophisticated empirical work we can do on this is going to be limited. But anyway, our motivation, so you see the green dots are connected either to red dots or to blue dots. So they are in coalition with the center left party or a center right party. And maybe surprisingly, since the green parties tend to lean to the left on the economic dimension, they are more often in bed with the center right than with the center left. And a similar picture for the radical right, and the purple join either a red dot or a blue dot, and you see now it's predominantly with the center right. Again, about 2/3 of these coalitions. Not as many as with the Greens, because of Godon, sanitaire, and things like this. Okay, so that's sort of the key patterns in the data and the key dimensions that the model will emphasize. We have prospectively these 4 types of parties, and they sometimes enter, and then they sometimes form a coalition with incumbent parties. So that's the sort of the area. Yes, Varech.
Yeah, so I totally agree, and I see that this is a really robust empirical fact that green parties are on the Galtan, dimension is on the left. So they are very liberal, and they are also, many of them promoting like gender plus, LGBTQ rights and other policies. But I mean, theoretically, it's unclear why green policies should be considered as liberal. And it could be, so is this something the model is about to address? Why do we see these kind of bundles in policies or not others?
That's a very long story. We can talk about it, but let me defer that to after the session. This is a classification that people have somehow groped on, and I tend to agree with you that some of the issues are bundled together a bit loosely. That's the practice, industry practice that we do.
Relatedly, is entry a kind of alternative to shifting right within the Conservative Party? And how do you do some of the Conservative Party positions?
Exactly. So the way I think about it is that in some countries we have very stable two-party system, like in the United States. Then shifts of policies happen via factions or entry of new politicians in the established party, with this Trump for example. The UK is sort of groping towards a multi-party system right now, otherwise it was similar. So, and that has to do with the logic of gaining parliamentary seats in a majoritarian system. So, but the same kind of forces could probably be brought to bear on what we're saying here, but since we're lacking a framework of party entry, we're trying to build.
Within the data set you're looking at, is that rightward or backward shift within parties?
There is some creep over time, and what I showed you were averages, but it's relatively limited. Okay, so now I dive in, and I apologize for this, but that's what you get. Now we're going to model building. So to think about this, we're going to look at the setting where there is economic and cultural heterogeneity in the population, in the electorate. So people are going to differ on a class dimension. So they're either having low income or high income, denoted by L and R. So, and there's economic inequality. The people that are poorer or richer than the average. So that's one dimension. On the cultural dimensions, we're going to think about 3 types. G types for gal, T for tan, and N for neutral. And there are shares of the population which we take as given. We could try to endogenize them, but let's first try to see what we can do with constant shares. We can do some accounting, so we can count up the number of people who are totally green from these building blocks of the smaller groups. We can do the same thing for the people that are T types, and we can average incomes by cultural groups, for example, something I will do later. It's all driven by the assumed types and the shares, population shares of those types. Then we're going to consider 3 types of policy instruments, 2 forms of regulation of the environment. So XG means higher XGs, harsher regulation of environmental pollution. So that runs between 0 and 1. There is regulation of migration. XT runs between 0 and 1. So more restrictions on migration, the higher that is. And both of these regulations have a cultural payoff, comes on the next page, but it also has an economic effect. So each income group is going to bear some economic cost that in principle could be positive and be a benefit, but we're going to think about it mostly as a cost. And for simplicity, we say that that's the same for both types of regulation. And then there is the third instrument, is the left to right stuff, an income tax that is levied on all gross incomes and used to pay a uniform transfer to everyone. So it's a very redistributive instrument. So that's the traditional political economics instrument. Then people will have preferences over these instruments. So for a member of group K, remember K was the indicator for your income, and J was the indicator for your cultural type. So you have a payoff from these 3 instruments where they are. And the economic part written down there is basically just your income level, your after-tax income post this redistributive cost plus your transfer. And then there we're going to assume that the total effects of are such that the rich always prefer the low tax level. That's their bliss point. The income tax runs between the lower bar and the upper bar, and the low income types always prefer the high income tax. Not very surprising. Now, in the cultural domain, which is a bit newer, we're going just to assume a linear payoff, which is such that the green types, they like green regulation, so their payoff is positive. The T types, they hate that, so their payoff is negative, and the neutral types, they don't care about it, so the payoff on the cultural side is 0. And conversely, for the T types, they like migration control, but they don't like the green stuff. So you can see there that we can think about CJ here as the salience of cultural conflict for both groups, because it sort of draws the distance between how much you hate it and how much you love it, depending on which side on the Galton dimension you are. And then this parameter KJ is like the skew of that conflict. So these parameters will shape the conflicts across the Greens and the nationalists in that dimension. So by construction, the Gs and the Ts, they deeply disagree over this formal regulation. And if the cultural benefit is large enough to outweigh the economic cost, then the Greens will always want pollution regulation, and the Ts will always want migration regulation. And we can derive their preferred policies, or the bliss points, as we call them, for each group, which is very predictable. As I said, the poor wants the highest possible tax, the rich want the lowest possible tax, and then the only ones who really want regulation are the green types who want potentially green regulation, and the nationalists who want the migration regulation. Okay, so that's the setting. Now let's look at political parties and how they sort of get votes and potentially win the elections and pursue their policies. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with a setting where there are only 2 incumbent mainstream parties. They are organized along this left to right dimension. So we label them L and R, same as the income. But in order to avoid confusion, parties are marked by a subscript rather than a superscript. It's subtle, but we think we get away with it. And then these parties are going to offer policy platforms to the voters on this 3-dimensional policy. We want to assume that they cannot commit, so platforms that are on offer have to be credible. How do they become credible? They are achieved by picking a type composition of candidates that will have exposed incentives to pursue the policies that are on offer. And we're going to assume that parties are policy motivated. So the preferences of a party reflects those of the party members. And we will assume that these party members come from the party's loyal voters. And we're going to assume that the party's loyal voters are the people who belong to group KN, meaning that the low income, neutral, those who are low income and are neutral on the cultural dimension, make up the loyal voters. So we're going to get party preferences according to what such a type would want policy to be. And the economic preferences of the party will reflect members' economic type. So trivially, the low-income party or the left party will want a high tax, and the high-income, the right party for the low income tax. And then the cultural preferences of the party reflect the members, and they are neutral on the cultural side, so they don't have a particular cultural benefit from either type of migration. They only perceive the regulatory costs, so they are going to not prefer any regulation. That doesn't mean that they will not necessarily pursue regulation, because they're also interested in holding power, because they want to pursue their redistributive preferred policies. So if swing voters are sufficiently interested in regulation, they are willing to offer it if it gives them a higher probability of doing their thing. So now for the voters' behavior, we're going to adapt a very well-known tool in political economics, the so-called probabilistic voting model. So I already mentioned that we have loyal voters, which are the low-income people and the high-income people who are neutral. So they always vote for the party that represents them income-wise. They don't have any other interests, so that's a very natural assumption. But then the other types, those that have preferences on the Galtan dimension, they are swing voters. So they are going to vote for either the right-wing or the left-wing party, depending on the policies that are on offer, but also on the basis of random choice. So there will be an aggregate shock, and there will be a voter-specific shock that smooths out responses of voters, because their vote is random from the viewpoint. So what happens in this setting is that these two parties announce these credible electoral platforms via their choice of candidates. These voter shocks are being realized. Everybody goes to the polls and vote, and then the platforms plus the voting shocks pin down the election outcome and also the realized policy, and then everyone goes home and get the payoff. Yeah.
Going back to what was asked earlier. So Galtan in this case is essentially equivalent to left and right then. Galtan, the distinction between Galtan is essentially going to be similar to left and right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think
you're going to see very soon how this gets resolved well, we can characterize how it is being resolved. So we look at an equilibrium, which is just a Nash equilibrium in taxes and regulation, which is such that it maximizes each party's expected utility, which is the expression that you have there, where PR is the probability that the right-wing party wins, and which I'm going to derive a couple of slides down the line. Now, since we require that policies are credible and parties only represent one income types, parties exposed will always want to pursue the policy that their members want, so the right-wing party in equilibrium will offer the low tax, and the left-wing party will offer the high tax, so we can focus on the more interesting regulation policies with this cultural language. So to figure out what parties are going to do, we have to know what swing voters are willing to do. So we can derive the economic preferences, the redistribution preferences for the collective of swing voters. So we sum over the G types and T types, and we get an expression which involves the difference in the tax rates and income of the swing voters on average relative to average income. So swing voters will sort of lean right or lean left, depending on whether their average income is below or above average income. And that's how their preferences in the economic dimension will look like. Then for the cultural or the regulation preferences, we're going to sum over the G's and the T's to get the average swing voter stance on the two types of regulation. We call that delta GS and delta TS. And that's going to involve the costs at the end. That's the second term there. But there's a first term which involves since we're looking at both G and P types, there are cross-cutting cleavages in the collective of swing voters. You know, for green regulation, the green types like it, but T types hate it. And analogously for the other type of regulation. So in order for swing voters as a whole to favor regulation, then those deltas have to be positive, and that happens only if one of these regulatory issues is culturally salient enough so that CJ being large, or that one of the groups is dominant, so the cross-cutting cleavages strike unevenly, or there's little opposition at the other end of the Galtan dimension, namely this KT is small. Otherwise, they are not going to like it. Yes?
The CJ and the KT, are they separately identified?
Sorry?
The CJ and the KT, are they separately identified? I was thinking earlier whether you needed both of them or you could just do it.
Yeah, it gives me an extra degree of freedom in the theory, but you're asking what if I were to estimate it.
Yeah, and then if they're not separately identified, how do you degree of freedom in the theory?
Yeah. I think we can live without one of them, but we have fewer degrees of freedom. I'll get to it in a second. Okay, so then we put these pieces together. We use the assumptions on voting shocks and the two types of voters. We can derive a parametric expression for the win probability of the right-wing party, which is written up there. Has two components. One is the relative size of the loyal voters for the two parties. As you remember, those were the neutral types. One may be larger than the other, then that party has an advantage in that dimension. And the other one is the vote of the swing voters, given that what they get on offer in terms of regulation and in terms of tax policies from the two parties. So now we can define a benchmark equilibrium where the G types and the T types get ignored. So as I mentioned, each of these parties can appeal to the swing voters by offering them some regulation on the issue where they potentially prefer it. This is costly because the party members who supply the party preferences don't like regulation, so they're against it. So that means that delta JK is negative. But there's a possible benefit because you can get the higher probability of winning, and if you have that gets realized, then you can pursue the party's favored redistribution, and that's captured by the fact that you like your own policy better than the other party's policies, and that can be a strong force. But then the benefit is obviously only positive if swing voters favor regulation. So that's this delta JS's have to be positive, which required one of these instances that I mentioned before. And it's going to be a larger benefit if their vote responds more. That's also corresponds to a particular parameter. So we show then that an equilibrium has both parties being passive on regulation, meaning that there is no environmental regulation, there is no migration regulation, if that particular condition is being satisfied, and it is that this regulatory cost outweighs the prospective negative from appealing to swing voters. So why do we emphasize this benchmark? I think it's instructive in two ways. One is that it may well capture the heydays of sort of traditional left to right politics in the many European countries at least have had in the post-war period. But it also shows how, these parties sidestep the groups who have these preferences over green issues and nationalistic issues. And this fact kind of sows the seed for party entry. Now we can think about a particular shock. Say that the environment becomes a more salient issue, so that green regulation also becomes, gives people a larger benefit. So that's, the parameter CG that I defined before, it becomes higher. But it can still be that the cross-cutting cleavages among the swing voters make the traditional parties unwilling to respond, because the green types like it, but the nationalist types may hate it. So, you don't want to appeal to the population as a whole. So then the equilibrium that we just studied will not respond. And then group G might find it convenient to form a body and enter into the electoral race to try to affect things that way. So you can think about the pre-entry phase as a sequence of equilibria, such as those described by proposition 1. No party has an incentive to offer any type of regulation. Voting shocks keep shifting power between the left and the right. So you're going to see switches in taxation, but you're never going to see any green regulation, nor are you going to see any migration regulation. So that's the sort of the starting point. Sorry for the long way up to this. Now let me consider a political equilibrium which does have entry in the political process. So the goal is to study the conditions under which either a Green Party or a nationalist, a radical right party organizes and runs in an election. So we're going to study two types of such entries. First, entry by a third party alone. And that party we're going to assume becomes the third largest party upon entry at least. Then we're going to study a form of backlash entry where the T party, just to be concrete, enters after the entry by the G party. So the timing is going to be the following. The G or the T party chooses to form and enter. An election with voting shocks gives the party's vote shares and seat shares in the legislature. What if no party gets a majority? There are three parties. Then the parties will try to form a government by bargaining over a policy program. So the policy vector that we have studied here, and then policies implemented and parties' chaos realized. So this shows that we have to study that bargaining process, which happens when no party has a majority of its own. But before that, let me just say one thing, that a new party then will represent a type, the G types or the T types, and they are going to have economic preferences and cultural preferences. So the cultural preferences are clear enough. They are, you like your form of regulation and you dislike the other type of regulation. And parties are going to try and pursue that if they have the chance to form a coalition. But you also have economic preferences. And since this party is composed by both poor and rich, the average income of a member of this party, at least if we assume, that all the the G types become loyal members of the G party if it forms. So then the economic preference is going to be a weighted average of the incomes of poor and rich. So, they are somewhere in between on the economic spectrum, the two other parties. So there's a prospective gains from trade. They can offer something that that is better for the traditional party than going with the other one, and in return it can get some favors on its regulatory issue. That's the logic that we're trying to show. So we have to have a formalized bargaining process. We do that as a game. So we add the legislative bargaining game after this unresolved election, where there are a few steps. There is a status quo policy, which is inherited from the past. So you can think about that as, the last period's equilibrium in this two-party game that we just had studied. It has no regulation, but a high tax or a low tax. And then the largest party in the legislature gets the ball and they make a take it or leave it proposal about the policy. If that's accepted by a majority, then that becomes policy and the basis for a new coalition government. But if that first round proposal fails, then the second largest party will make a proposal with probability 1 minus SE, but the entrant also has a chance of making a proposal with probability SE. Okay? If that's accepted by a majority, then it becomes policy. Otherwise, you go to the status quo and implement last election periods, regulations, and taxes. Okay? So, what's the result of this government formation phase? That's something we have to sort out. And the paper fully characterizes the solution to this game for entry by either party, whether it's a G party or a T party, whether that entering party leads left or right on redistribution, depending on what the average income is of the party. For the two possible status quo vectors, high taxes or low taxes, no regulation. So that's one of the outcomes of proposition 1. And then when party R or party L is the largest party, while, as I said, party E always be the third largest. So that's a lot of cases, and we sorted out in an appendix. So to build intuition for why the results are what they are, let's consider a particular case where the entrant party is green, where that green party leans left, as they did on average in the classification that you saw on the motivating map, where the status quo is a high tax equilibrium, so the left party ruled in the previous period, and where the left party also in this period is the largest party, and therefore makes the first round proposal. It becomes the formateur, as it were. What that also means is that if you reach round 2, then the green party will have to bargain with the right, because that's the sort of natural thing. Okay, so now let's look at the possibilities for that bargaining. So let's first look at the case where the right-wing party makes a proposal. So I've drawn the strategic situation in this diagram, and it's naturally in the space where the two parties can agree, namely on the green regulation, XG on the vertical axis, and on the tax rate on the horizontal axis. I've drawn in blue the bliss points of the two parties. So the green party is to the left. It likes full regulation of the environment, and it likes the high tax by assumption, because we assume that it was leaning left. And then down to the left, we see the blue bliss point of the right-wing party. It likes low taxes and it likes no regulation of the environment. So it looks like an Edgeworth box there, where utilities increasing in opposite directions for the two parties as you move about. And now the right-wing party can call the shots. What is it going to do? It's going to give the Green Party the lowest utility level that it doesn't say no. And the default for the Green Party here is to say no and get the status quo. That's marked by red. So what the right-wing party is going to do is to keep the Green Party at its participation constraint to go along and pick a point which is a tangent to its own indifference curve, as I've illustrated in the diagram. And that's a tax rate in between the two incumbent parties' tax rate and a finite regulation rate. But it can also happen by chance, we assume that that's random, that the party G gets to make a proposal. So now it has the upper hand. So it can hold the right-wing party to the utility that it gets at the status quo point. So we get a new solution where the Green Party is doing much better. It gets a higher tax closer to its bliss point, and it gets a higher regulation than it had on the previous solution. So now it has the power, and it's predictably doing better. Okay, so what's equilibrium policy going to be now that we know what's the outcome of this strategic bargaining between parties R and G? Well, this outcome becomes like a continuation value for the Green Party. This is what it can expect to do in round two. We have to take a weighted average of its outcomes, and that's what I do in the equation there that has BG. So when the status quo is uppercase T bar, the right-wing party is the next largest party, and G proposes with probability SG, and we can compute its expected utility. I've done so, and you see it's the utility that you can expect at the status quo plus a surplus. The surplus is the difference between the outcomes when you call the shots and when you don't call the shots, times the probability that you're calling the shots. And therefore, the outcome for the Green Party is strictly increasing in its probability of making a proposal. Now we go to round one, where party L is making the first proposal. It anticipates this future outcome, so it's going to pick the policy that is best for its members, subject to the fact that it has to satisfy the Green Party. What does it mean to satisfy the Green Party? To give it at least its continuation utility. So that's exactly what is stated towards the bottom of the page. So G is going to be better off in this equilibrium. It's also going to get some regulation from the first round proposer, and it's going to do better the higher its probability to propose, i.e. the higher its bargaining power in the government coalition proposal. Okay, so in the paper in proposition 2, in the appendix, and observation 2 in the paper, we spell out equilibrium policies in all alternative cases, and as well as their comparative statics. So there's only one thing I want to take away from that, and is that we can define the party's payoff, the minimum payoff of the entering party. And quite intuitively, that payoff is going to be minimized when it has no proposal power, i.e. when SG is equal to 0. It cannot propose it whenever you go to the second part. Now with this insight, we can study the entry incentives. This is only what happens if there has been entry. Now, will there be entry? Well, we can derive the condition for entry, and if we do that when the payoff to the entering party is the smallest, namely when its bargaining power is 0, then this is going to be a sufficient but not a necessary condition. Because if it enters in that case, when it has the lowest possible bargaining power, then for sure it's going to enter if it has higher bargaining power. So that's what we do. So now to see how that works out, let me use the example again of the Green Party that leans left. So when does that Green Party choose to enter in the game? We have to compare its payoff when it doesn't enter with the payoff when it enters. So when it enters, let EKG be the probability that party K, that's either right or left, has its own majority after the entry. So then it can ignore any government bargaining. And then we can define QKG in the case where there is no large party that has its own majority. That's the probability that the party is largest and therefore makes the first proposal. So then we can compute the expected post-entry payoff for this left-leaning green type. That's what we do in that equation, and magically it reduces to a very simple expression. And once we stare at that expression, compare it to the no entry payoff, we get the next result. A new party E, G in the example that leans left will always enter if the entry cost is low enough. If the pre-entry probability of the, in this case, the right-wing party is higher than the post-entry probability for that right-wing party to have its own majority. So entry happens when the probability of a single party or majority goes down after the entry. How to understand that? It's pretty simple. The outside option for a left-leaning Green Party, if it bargains with R, is a particular number that came out of before. It's the its payoff at high taxes. So this pins down its post-entry payoff. But if R wins, its right-wing party wins its own majority, then it imposes a policy with low taxes, which is worse for the green entry than high taxes, because it leans left. And therefore, if the probability of this event goes down, it must pay to enter. And then if you have a right-leaning entrant, then you just reverse the argument. So then final question is whether that proposition will hold in our electoral model. Now we have, given a condition, but we haven't derived it from the election model in which this is embedded. And we have to make a couple of assumptions. So we assume that all G types become loyal voters for party G if it exists. We assume that the T types are still swing voters. They'll never vote for G, but they'll support either the incumbent party, depending on the policies on offer and the random shocks. And then we can show, which is proposition 4 in the paper, that the condition is very, very likely to hold in our voting model. It holds whenever the new party diminishes the vote share of both the other parties, which is a very, very likely outcome. So I'm running out of time, so I should try to minimize what I'm saying now. We also study other types of entry. So far, we looked at the policy-seeking entry, where party enters to influence policy via this coalition formation, whereas the paper studies these two types of backlash. So one type of backlash is when there has been a conversion of the incumbent parties. Maybe the picture of former Prime Minister Johnson at the time when he was Green. Something has happened that makes an incumbent party pick a policy such as which is its favorite redistributive policy, but now regulation on the green dimension. Suppose that is the case. Then you have a new status quo. Under that status quo, there's no need for a green party to enter because there is somehow, the policy is already leaning in the green direction. But for the other party, there may be an incentive to enter. So we show formally that the only ones that consider entry in this situation would be the nationalists. Then we can derive, again, a very likely condition in terms of election probabilities under which the nationalists will enter and form a Tea Party. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that a left-leaning party G has entered, formed a coalition with the right to set the policy with some green regulation and the compromise on tax policy. Now a right-leaning Tea Party may enter and steal the coalition away. So allow the right-wing party to form a coalition with it and reverse the policy on the green arena. Without the Nationalist Party having entered, if it wanted to rule, the right-wing party had to be in bed with the Greens. Now it can be in bed with the radical right instead, and then the policy will reverse towards less green regulation or some regulation or a combination.
We need to at least allow one or two questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, so let me just say what's in the rest of the paper. We say that, much of this is, we don't consider anticipation of entry and deterrence. There are various ways one could introduce that. We haven't done that yet in the model, but we can consider agreements not to include the new party in the coalitions. When would that be credible? That's the cordon sanitaire, or no government with the AfD. Other countries have tried that, but they have failed. When in the setting, is it credible to make such an agreement? We can think about the parties adjusting current policy to reshape future policy outcomes. We can think about reducing the influence of future entrants by changing the rules of the game for government formation so as to make it hard for an entering party to do so. That can draw on the existing literature. And then finally, we go back to data. We show that the correlations after green entry, where we are defining the control group for after green entry or radical right entry in the right way, in the way that the model prescribes, has the right signs and, they're relatively precisely estimated. This is a static difference in difference. Even the event study plots after the entry of a Green Party, and when we look at environmental stringency or immigration stringency, looking to go in the right direction, but there is a pre-trend. But that pre-trend is probably due to this anticipatory behavior. It's not, an artifact. It's something that ought to be explained. So I'm out of time. So I've given you a formal framework to study party entry. It's motivated by real-world events, the green and radical right parties. Highlights drivers of party entry. 3 types. We hope this framework can be useful to ourselves and to others to interpret real-world events and to guide empirical research on party entry, its connection to coalition formation and to policy change. But obviously, it's a very, very preliminary first step, and more work should follow both on the theoretical and empirical front.
Absolutely. So we are now into our tea break time. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 questions that you to people.
So, I mean, starting this is like, you talked about kind of cultural issues. So different way of thinking about it is that, green issues or anti-immigrant issues are fundamentally about thinking about economic issues. And so, so what's happened with, say, these environmental issues is just that there's this changing policy dimension to think about economic issues. So I'm trying to think about why you need to introduce an additional dimension of kind of culture, rather than just thinking about this as these are just fundamentally different policies which have to do with inequality. It's a little bit going back to, I think, my talk, I was trying to relate the two a bit more. And trying to think of this in terms of just changing dimensions of how you respond to inequality, and how something like, say, an pollution, being against a pollution tax means being more pro-rich, because those costs are borne more by the poor.
Yeah, no, one can write such papers, and some people have written such papers. When you present that in front of political scientists, they say, how can you ever think that this is only an economic issue? It's a deeply cultural issue. When people take a stance on immigration, it's a cultural issue, and if you look at how it correlates with income when people reply to survey questions, there's almost no slope. For the environment, there is some slope, but it's very minuscule compared to the big differences that you find between, say, less educated and educated people on both these sides.
Yes.
I guess I had a related question. Would it follow from the framework? And sorry if I missed it, but let's say I'm an entrepreneur and I just want really low taxes, and now nativism is salient. Is that saying that entry allows me to achieve that? Would the equilibrium tax rate be lower? Yeah. Get some. Because I give up on nativism.
Any others?
People are wary of their children.
Well, just on this issue, though, I mean, I think it is interesting. I actually think the cultural side does come in. I mean, we shouldn't assume that environmentalism is only about the left. If you rank American presidents in terms of their environment, it was a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, #1. It was actually Richard Nixon, a Republican, #2. Why? For very different reasons. But in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, it had nothing to do with the economy. It had everything to do with his belief in the beauty of nature and his desire to go hunting buffaloes, basically.
I would call
it like that.
I would call it values.
Yeah, value, that's right. Yes. And in the case of Nixon, it was just that he didn't really care that way, but he saw it politically very attractive. And I do think it's incredibly valuable what you've done in sort of formalizing something which so far has to be conversation rather than than precision. But as you say, there's so many other interesting issues that could follow from this. Robin.
I guess I'm just gonna think about whether the kind of background of what was happening. So there's one big thing happening in the environment, climate change. And some people putting that ahead of everything. So that's different from the 70s or the 80s. And the other thing that's happening is that massive income inequalities are getting ever richer. And will do anything to control their rent. So it's not like the kind of background environment is the same in the 70s and 80s. But the period when these things are coming, which is the 90s and 2000s, those things are happening. I mean, increasing in the 2000s, climate change. I'm just wondering how but both those things, I guess, would push people to either G or so is that.
Yeah, I think about these events, external events that you're talking about. It could before climate change. It could be Fukushima or something else. The Green Party started as regards to nuclear power and all the difficulties with that. So that's definitely going on. And when people grow up, they form their attitudes. So we should see generational effects when people in their formative age think about how to take a stance in politics and what way to put to different issues. Then there is this interplay because that was not the only thing that happens. At the same time, we had the increase in inequality, and it's kind of in the model. I didn't have time to emphasize it, but the more income inequality there is in this simple setting, that would be a bigger gap between the rich and the poor, and that if they are to be represented by right-wing and left-wing policies, then that polarization will affect their willingness to take an issue on the appeal to the swing voters for the two-party system. If there's more polarization on economic issues, I am more desperate to get power, and therefore I'm more desperate to seek the support of everyone who thinks differently. And then I go to the swing voters with some environmental regulation. So the two can be complementary in driving. Here it just didn't spell out the set of shifts of parameters that could trigger that initial one. It's just a possibility theorem rather than exhaustive catalog, but one could well do that. And that would be one way of using this framework, trying or some variant.
Thank you, Torsten.